ada mobil jemput bisa. Iya ini jam berapa besok?
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Uplifting Indonesia. We're happy to welcome you to our new international series under the topic of church and state. We're joined with our first international special guest, my good friend Jackson Dunn. Hello, Jackson. How are you doing?
Good, thanks, Edward. Thanks for letting me here on Uplifting Indonesia. It's nice to talk to you here.
Yeah, we're very grateful for your availability. And maybe before we jump into the topic, we need to talk a little about yourself so the audience can know you better.
Sure,
so,
sounds good.
I've been following your work, and I saw that you have been involving yourself in such a huge areas of interest. You talk a lot about humanity, about history, about philosophy, religious studies, and develop this comprehensive perspective to talk about our contemporary issues. How do you describe your life and work?
Thanks, Edward. So I am an environmental scientist. If you read the flyer, which is a sort of interesting place to begin, getting into humanities and specifically into our topic, talking about church and state. It seems like the farthest thing away from a scientific career. But what's interesting about environmental science as compared to other sciences is if you go into mathematics, mathematics is a science based on fact. 2 + 2 is 4, fact. Physics is the same thing. What goes up will come down. You know, you study gravity. Yes, there's so much to discover, there's so much to explore, but in the end, it all comes down to fact. One of the interesting things when you get into environmental, and actually this is true of engineering, even though it's very practical and applied, you are asking yourself a second question. You're asking yourself, how can I fix the problem I see in the world? And so you take your scientific knowledge from physics, you take it from math, but it is to answer that question of what is the world around me and what can I do to change it to make it better? And so when I got into college, that was my interest. You know, I wanted to go in and I wanted to learn science and I wanted to learn how can I make the world a better place. And what I realized is that so many of our solutions to problems are based in our philosophical understanding of those problems in the beginning. And so I took a lot of time to learn about philosophy, to learn about Plato, who is certainly my favorite philosopher from history. I know he's one of the most popular as well, but I always loved his work, and also modern political philosophy, because all of the rules that we have in our world about how we have to do things, the legal rules, they are informed by what we have decided is true in the world, whether that be the scientific facts, things that I study, or religious facts, or facts about philosophy. These are all things that have to be put together before you can make that answer of how do I make the world better? Because what is better if you haven't first decided what is better and what is worse? You have to make a moral judgment. And so my work has been into how can I take my scientific understanding and take it and make moral judgments with it. And so that's why I, an environmental scientist, am joining you here today.
So great. So what's interesting is you mentioned that you're deeply influenced by Plato. So maybe you can elaborate how the way he affects your thinking, so we can anticipate that he is your pattern, your main source of thought before developing this comprehensive perspective of contemporary issues.
Sure. So Plato was one of the first philosophers that we hear of today that brings what I would call a secular understanding of the world. So he was not by any means irreligious. Actually, in the time of Plato and in the time of Socrates, it was considered blasphemy to say anything against the system of gods that the Greeks had at the time. And that may be for better or for worse, but one of the things that Plato came up with is the idea that you have to look critically at your world and you can determine that things are true and false from the way it looks. And they don't have to be scientific facts. Science is supposed to answer the question of what is going on around me? Why is it going on around me? But it can never answer what is the reason for it going on around me. That's something that is specifically a philosophical and a moral judgment. And people like Plato took it and made it into its own science of what can I determine is true without looking at specifically science, but I have to use logic at the same time. I can't just feel like, oh, this is true for me. I have to actually make it a science of this is something I can determine about the world, and therefore it's something I can determine about myself. And so I've always really enjoyed that pragmatic way of looking at the world.
All right. So you adapted your curiosity and your calling for the better world from science, and then you see our contemporary reality from the perspective of humanity, and you develop your framework mainly from Plato. So it's a great start for us. So starting to even know your work for better, are you currently still doing your podcast or your public service as an influencer to talk about humanity, or are you working on something else right now?
Actually, yeah, that's interesting to talk about. I stopped 1 year ago because of the pandemic here that shut down my radio station that I had been working with. Apologize for the dog in the background. I am now, I just talked to my friend from Brazil, actually, a good friend of mine. We had been in an international group, which is actually how I had heard and gained some interest and love into the problems of Indonesia and the beautiful country which it is. And we are actually talking about doing a podcast on international lifestyle coming up in the future. We don't have a start date for that, so I'm not advertising it, but yes, we are going to try to continue that podcast.
Great. So yeah, maybe we can collaborate for more and make it a more long-term partnership. So,
absolutely, yeah, I'll have to talk to him.
Yeah, talking about your background as an environmental scientist, do you have a little picture of how we can imagine your college life, and how did an environmental scientist can find this interest and develop his ideas into these areas of humanity? How did it happen?
Certainly. I assume that my college life wasn't that much different than many people's, and I know Edward, you're continuing your studies, so I'm sure in many ways it's the same for you. But the world is just such an interesting place. You know, you meet interesting people, and I think college for me was a great place for that. I was raised on a rural farm in the middle of New York. Most people think of New York as New York City and lights, but I was raised in a very poor area. And I really didn't have a whole lot of experience with the world. And when I got into college, I found that there was an interesting juxtaposition, an interesting contrast. There was both an exposure to a huge amount of people with so many different experiences, which I loved. But I also didn't love that a lot of the college experience, including the environmental science field that I got into, was very, very dogmatic. It was built on an understanding of the world that was at its core an atheistic understanding. And so, for instance, I got into one class. It was an ethics class. So we were studying about how we can actually, basically what we're going to talk about today, how we can tie science and we can tie ethics and morals together. And one of the professors said basically that during my class, you have to say in your papers that you write for me that people are animals and that people are only biological. So they don't have any spiritual side to them. And you have to take all your answers from this perspective. And I was very confused because I'm like, yes, okay, people are, certainly we are biological creatures. We're not different from an animal in that sense. But there is something different about the way we see the world, because we can see the world from a moral perspective. And if you're someone like myself, who is also a believer in God, and I try to be outspoken about that when I do podcasts, you have to believe that there's something bigger than the world. If we look out, for instance, in astronomy, we look out at the stars, we can see a horizon of where the stars sort of end. What's beyond that horizon? We don't know. We don't know what happened before the universe came about. We can't answer that question, at least not from a scientific perspective, because past that horizon, the rules don't apply. So the only way that we can answer those questions, if we answer the why are we here, what is the reason? And that is a philosophical, that is a moral question. And to do that, at least for me, I find that you come face to face with God. And when you look at science from a perspective of, I believe in God, you find it to make a lot more sense because the why is answered. And I don't want to get too religious so that people who are not religious don't miss the point. I'm not, say, coming on here and preaching a sermon, but I think that it answers a question that science cannot, which is how are we supposed to live? Because if we're in an atheistic position, then it's fine if we murder, because it's survival of the fittest. We are making our system more fit over time. So we have to answer the question of why are we here before we can answer what should we do here.
Okay, so great. So your main concern towards our today's society were colored by the presence of a materialistic professor who reducted the reality into material matters. So so it's an interesting thing that you say. We are not going to preach right here because some people are not ready for that thing, and it's going to be a good topic to talk about the way people perceive this religious reference in the public space. We're going to get into that right away. But I guess we can get into our topic about the encounter of religion and politics. So looking back into the history, the interaction between the two has not always been good. Sometimes we celebrate the synergy between the two, but sometimes it turns out to be a plain disaster. So how do you see the interaction or the encounter between religion and politics throughout the history?
So that's a good question, and I'm happy to actually be talking about it with you, because when we first originally started the podcast, we had been wanting to talk about a political topic, and now we're talking about something that's maybe more religious in nature. So I think this is exciting to be able to be here with you and talking about that. So when we look at history, one of the things that we see is that people, like my professor said, people are animals. But at the same time, people have always been, from the very beginning of recorded history, people have been also spiritual creatures. You can go from the very earliest times to today, and there has not been a time when people haven't been strongly influenced, for better or worse, by their understanding of the higher power. In other words, God. one of the things that you see is that this was the first idea of politics, actually, was the idea of a king. And the king, in essence, is God on earth for his people. The kings of old, if you look at ancient times in ancient Babylon or in ancient Israel in the Bible, or even going up more recently into the sultans in the Islamic world, you see that they had a religious function. They were supposed to be revered. You bowed for the king. You obeyed the king no matter what the king said. When the king said, "We will go to war," you fought and you died for your king. And we had a respect, we as people had a respect for that authority because it represented something that we are missing in ourselves, which is that control over the world that comes only from God. And when we look back at history, the first time that changed from the understanding of the king as a religious figure, at least the first one that I can see is actually the Greek Empire. So the Greek Empire, of course, was the start of the Western world, if you will. And the Greek Empire and philosophers such as Plato took the idea of a church. So they of course had their temples, had their gods, had their religion at the time, but they took that and they separated that from the political system, from the king. So the king was actually distinct from the priests, and this had never been really tried before anywhere in the world. There were many times where the king was not particularly a religious figure, but the king was always looked up to as a religious figure would be looked up to. But Plato and Socrates basically took the idea of the world as a religious construct, and they said the world itself is religion. The world itself, there is God in the world. They all supposed this. But they said there are certain things about people too. There are certain truths we can learn about people. And there are certain truths that we can take and we can apply to our political system that don't have to be religious in nature. And this led to a revolution in the way that people understood politics, because now politics were not, if you disobeyed the king, you were disobeying God. Now, if you disobeyed the king, you could be obeying God. They could be two separate things. And it's the truth. At least from my experience, is that just because the king said it didn't mean it was right. And this is actually what led to many of the wars of the past, is the philosophical differences between two kingdoms. But nowadays it happens much more internally within countries, as people realize they have the ability to determine what is right and what is wrong within their own heads. And that's something that came from those early philosophers that we really have to thank them for, that we can do today.
So you're saying that the origin of philosophy, the origin of politics begins when the people start to use their own thinking capabilities, their own criticism towards what is done by their leaders of their society, and I see the same patterns in the metamorphosis of philosophy. So in the earlier form, it was purely mysticism, and people usually passed on the stories about the origin of the universe without ever even questioning it, and it is completely done by the banking system. So there is no use of your critical sense in that situations. But then philosophy transformed into a more critical thinking, and then people started to realize that the government or their leader It's not simply what does God wants for them to do. So here comes an interesting question from our audience.
Certainly.
Mr. Panching 78. His question is, for most people, politics nowadays is seen to be a dirty thing. So how can the church play a role in that notion? That's the question.
That's a great question. So I'd answer that in this way. And again, I think that there is a huge need, and this is a personal thing that I think is each person's responsibility, to look back at the mistakes of both the church and of political systems in the past, and to implement the changes that need to be made within your own life. Because once you influence your own life, you influence the sphere of politics at large. Maybe only a tiny bit, but you do. One of the things that I think you can say about that is that what our system has done, Plato and Aristotle were not the first thinkers. We're not the first critical thinkers who thought differently than the king, of course, right? There were rebels, there were heroes, there were people who thought different things. But they separated the idea of you do not have to be online with the king and made it into its own science form, right? The problem is that when you rely too much on your own knowledge, something that both Plato and Aristotle cautioned against was the fact that your brain can trick you. Not everyone's brain is perfect. And if you believe that you are a purely biological being, like that professor I told you about earlier, you come across the problem of maybe you're thinking wrong. Maybe what you have figured out in your own head as the correct ethic for the world is actually wrong. And unless you are informed by religion, you don't have anything to check yourself against. Unless you're informed by society, you don't have anything to check yourself against. And what I think you'll notice nowadays with the politics being dirty is that for many countries, because the politics and the church are so separated, that the politicians don't have any incentive within themselves, within their own personal ethics, to do what is honest. Plato actually talked about this in his book, The Republic. He talked about the fact that the most dishonest man who can present himself as honest, as most politicians do today, right? Even if they're the most dishonest, they want to look honest in public. And if you look in only a secular sense, they're the most happy people because they can get all the benefits of dishonesty without any of the disadvantages of people not trusting you. And what he realized was we can show that those dishonest people are not the most happy. And the systems that they build, dirty systems, dirty political systems, fall apart eventually. This happens to all empires. It happened to the Roman Empire as they fell apart and the Vandals took over. It happened to the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s after World War II when the Ottoman Empire fell apart. And it happens because these people who do not have this sense of ethics become the political leaders, and there is no interplay. One thing I want to talk about a little later, and I'm going to, of course, I want to get your input first, is actually how we can address modern political systems without changing the political systems, but add in that influence of church to keep the people who are in power honest.
So, before jumping into our subtopic about how the interplay between the religion and the politics, there's another question regarding the nature of the two. So politics is synonymous with corruption. So how can we as a church synergize with politicians in fighting for environmental damage issues? It's a question from Professor Paratu.
Oh, interesting. So to Professor Paratu, one thing that I think is a misconception is that church and state can be separated. It is not a reality, even though it is an ideal. one of the things that we have the biggest problem is, should you leave your ethics behind to become a politician so that you're unbiased for everyone? Or should you bring those ethics in and maybe make decisions that upset people who do not believe as you do? And my understanding is that you must bring in your ethics into politics. Because if you don't, as you said, politics becomes synonymous with corruption. You cannot have a moral system without a set of morals. It must be corrupt by nature if it does not have a moral set of rules. And so the trouble is when you do not have the moral system and the political system separated from each other in a way that they can both check each other, or that they both have some sort of power. For instance, I'm not saying that this is the most ideal system by any means, but in the state of Aceh in Indonesia, it is both governed by the constitutional, majority in the parliament, but it also has its own autonomy under Sharia law. So there are certain things that the politicians or the people who run Aceh are allowed to do. They're allowed to implement within their borders some sort of pressure for people to obey the law in the way that they think is moral, according to Islam. However, they are still underneath the power of the secular political system that is run by the entirety of Indonesia. Now, does this mean that they have made the correct system? Certainly not. It doesn't say that the system is correct or not. But what it does say is that their morals are clear. So for the people who live in that state, what is allowed and what is not is much more clear. Whether it's good or bad, it is clear. And I think that when you have a church and a state that are both separate from each other, but both have power within society, you have a much more clear system to work under. And even if you see that the system is wrong, you do not see that the system is corrupt. One of the things that actually made America great when it was first rising, the reason why it was able to so quickly implement the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, was the fact that people had a moral sense of honest business. They believed that business should be handled in an honest fashion with the world, and yet they still had a secular system of government. So they both had the moral sense of honesty that informed business decisions and the political sense of autonomy from the church. And so you have people who are easily able to trade with each other. This is where that philosophical difference comes. It's the problem with the breakdown now of society is there are two moral systems, more or less, that have become ingrained into politics, where China and the Eastern Bloc countries, at least as we call them here in the United States, have a communist political system, and they believe that the state should be run like a business, that the person at the top of the state should be able to make people be hired or fired at his will because he is the ultimate business leader. And then the moral idea in the Western world, which is that the president is someone who needs to be popular with his people. And when you have two ethical systems that are at odds with each other, the system will generally break down. So when you find corrupt political systems, it's because people's morals and ethics in government are not informed by a central idea of what is right and wrong. And usually that comes from religion.
So I got two questions that crossed my mind. So the first one is, I remember if I'm not mistaken, it was in the farewell speech of George Washington, where he said that the moral foundation is essential to develop and to build the country into a better society. So how do you say about it?
I think he's right, because I want to give you a quick example from science. So the scientific idea of philosophy comes from what is called utilitarianism, which is what is best for the most people at one time. So for instance, if you have to, let's say, make this shirt that I'm wearing, let's say, okay, it provides money for the person who makes the shirt. It provides me with the shirt, so it makes two people happy. But you have to take the cotton and bleach it, and you have to pour that bleach in the ground. So you're killing a certain amount of animals, let's say with the bleach, just as an example. So is two people's happiness worth whatever you kill when you pour that bleach in the ground? And usually we say yes, right? So I think that one of the things that religion really does is it gives us other ways to look at what is good and what is bad. It's not just what is good for the most amount of people, because what's good for the most amount of people can be very bad for the rest. One of the places where that I think came to be the worst is the Holocaust in Germany during World War II. In an attempt to create more jobs, to create a better life for Germans, the German government realized, look, if I say that the Jews caused all the problems and then I kill all the Jews, there will be more open land for Germans, there will be more open jobs for Germans, there will be all these things. By the way, they might have been correct, but they had no moral guidance. So they couldn't say that even though this might be best for, there was more Germans than Jews, so it might be better for more Germans than Jews. We're doing something horrible in the world, right? We're creating a tragedy in the world by killing many people, right? And so science will never be able to answer that without religion first informing you about what is a line too far to cross. What is the line that must be kept? What is, and that is what George Washington was talking about. You cannot have a society that has all the answers, because how do you know when you're off of the answers if you don't have a sense of where that line is? It's like a train, you have to have rails, or else how can you tell that the train is off the track?
So I see that you're comparing some classical mainstream within the discipline of ethics between the utilitarianism and the ontology, and then finally we have the divine command, where we put the truth itself above the benefit for the greatest number that is provided by the utilitarianism. And it's exactly the blind spot for democracy, I guess. So you remember the story between three animals, two wolves and a chicken, discussing about what they should eat for the night, and that is not going to be a cool story for the chicken, right?
Exactly, but it's great for the wolves.
Yeah. So
exactly.
my second question is about the relationship between the two, between the church and the state. A lot of people has been misunderstanding the term of building the wall of separation between the church and the state. Could you give us a setup or a background? How did this originally happen?
Certainly.
Where did this start? This kind of misunderstanding to interpret this term that put people into so opposite position of interpreting it.
Certainly. So the idea of church and state is a very old one. Of course, it came back from the idea of philosophy, which we talked about earlier, in the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, where you have a political system that is separate from the religious system. However, the term separation of church and state actually came from Thomas Jefferson, who is an American politician during the founding of the United States, the Republic. And what he realized was that in Europe at the time, that there was no separation between church and state. So the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, was also a political leader. He even is today. He leads the Vatican City. Now, obviously, his power is much reduced. But back in his day, the Pope controlled much of the known world, in certainly the Western world, controlling the Hungarian Empire, much of England, much of France at different times, much of Italy. And what they realized was that the Pope would make political decisions and then say they came from God. And it caused a lot of darkness. Actually, you can even trace some of the large natural tragedies, I believe, of the past. For instance, the Black Death, when the bubonic plague took over England. Now, we know now that it took over England because rats were infesting the country. They had no hygiene. The rats were infesting the country. People didn't wash themselves off from their feces, and so there was rampant disease within their communities. There were fleas, there were problems, everyone was getting sick. But the church said that it was because God was angry at them, and so they needed to pay the church and to ask God forgiveness for their sins. Now, you can say that, if certainly for some religious people, you can say that all evil things come because of sins, but in reality, those are not the same solution, right? The solution to a disease is to find the medicine for it and then wash yourself, keep yourself away from that disease, right? So you can't answer all of the same questions from the same perspective. What Thomas Jefferson was talking about was the fact that you could not answer the question of what people should do from a religious perspective if all the people in that group did not have the same religious understanding. For instance, most of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, making the United States its own country, were Christian, but they were not all Christian. Some of them believed that what was considered a deist perspective at the time, which is that God existed, but he wasn't involved in human affairs. And some of them were not particularly religious in any way. And how can you get those people to agree with you? If you're a religious person, right? For instance, I go to church. I want people to be honest in the same way that I've been taught to be honest by God. But how can I get you to agree to that if you have a different religion than me? I have to first be able to say that there is a separation there of what is true and what my God says. Because to say this is what God says, you have to first prove to that person that God is real. And that won't happen for every person. It will only happen for some people. And so he was talking about the fact that you must be able to separate those two concepts. The idea that God is real and I want to be informed by this morality, and the fact that this morality exists as a fact, a scientific fact, even if you will, that people in a society should follow. And so you must be able to separate truth from religion to be able to build a society of people from diverse cultures and diverse backgrounds.
So I guess it's the third wave of change within the society, where you describe the first wave was where we see the truth inside of a king, and then we learn to differentiate between what does the king wants and what does God wants. But then in 1800, this shift is changing for one more time, where we can differentiate what does God wants and what is true and what does my God wants, because it doesn't simply apply to everyone who believes in God. So my question is, a lot of people thought that this separation between church and state is something that has a legal standing, but actually it was not even in the Constitution, right? So how do you describe, how do you interpret this separation? Because it has put people into a position into believing that it's a phrase to protect the state from the church, or to protect the church from the state? How do you see it?
So I think that this is one of the most troubling questions. And I think actually it is one of the largest problems that I have observed in democratic society. Because the idea of democracy is that, of course, that in most cases, at least, a majority of the people have to agree on something for it to go into law. And that is a political perspective, but it also is informed by religion in ways that people don't realize, because look, to get a majority of people to believe any one thing, you have to first convince them of its truth. For instance, during the early 1900s, and this is actually one of, I think, the most funny cases of where the separation of church and state failed, is during the Prohibition in the early 1900s in the United States. In other words, alcohol was prohibited to be sold within the United States. And this was actually put into our Constitution. Our Constitution is the only document that can change the way in which the church and state actually interact in the United States. Other than that, it has to be smaller levels of government. The federal government is not allowed to touch anything religious based. And it was very funny because to convince enough people to change our Constitution, which is one of the most difficult, pieces of law to change, you have to first convince them that alcohol is so bad for society, that it will destroy society. So it has to be part of your political solution to ban alcohol. And so they did that. People did that. Churches actually did that. They went out and they spoke on the evils of drunkenness. Now, we all know, I think nowadays, that being a drunkard, an alcoholic, is a bad thing, because we see the bad influence on society. But it was an interesting moment in which that line was crossed of, okay, this is a bad thing, but now it's a certain church says that it's so bad that it will destroy our society and it will destroy our moral sense. It will destroy how we see God. And enough people were convinced that it changed the law. Now, this was changed quickly back because of the political system here, and I won't go into that. But it is a funny moment at which religion stepped into the political sphere. But I think people misunderstand the fact that you cannot remove religion from politics, but you can put them at odds. Not fighting like a war. You don't want religion and politics to be fighting a war, because then you end up with situations like the Middle East right now, where there are some countries that are more or less political countries, not even the Middle East, but here's one, India and Pakistan. Pakistan is, of course, a Muslim majority republic that is based on Sharia law. And India is a secular one. And if you put them at odds in that way, then they will split into two countries, which is what happened. All of it was India at one point, and then it fell apart. But what you want to do is you want to be able to say that people have to answer to both powers. People have to answer to the government, but they have to answer to God first. They have to answer to their moral sense first. And this is a very, very difficult thing to achieve in a democratic society, because most people think that they have to only answer to what is legal instead of what is right. And I don't know that there is a good solution to that. The only solution that I've been able to find so far is that religious people of faith, have to be able to convince people around them of the truth of what they believe. Not of that it feels good, not that it's right for them, but that for some reason it is true. And if you can do that, that truth will pervade, that truth will come into the political system, at least on the level in which they can influence it. And that makes a huge difference. That makes all of the difference between a failing and a successful democracy.
So that's why you see the benefit of how religious thought can affect the political movement rather than the other
Correct.
way around. And
Correct.
and I saw the one of the biggest challenge to that is because of some people thinking about the separation between church and state is the abolition, or instead of the freedom of the religion, it's rather becoming the freedom from religion right now. How do you see this problem?
I think you have it right. I think it is the freedom from religion that people think that they want, and it is freedom of religion that people need. There is a much more modern philosopher, C.S. Lewis is his name, who was in England during the time of World War II, and he actually writes some amazing books on this, which I would suggest to your listeners to read. He talks about the fact that you have to be able to inform what you know is right by God. And I think one of the biggest things is that nowadays there is this trend to not think critically about the world. In the past, in many societies where critical thinking was encouraged, including philosophical societies like Roman society, they were all deeply religious. And the reason is because there are things you cannot explain about the world without understanding that there was a creator, without understanding that there is rules to the world that were created by something. And to be able to understand rules that are created, for instance, why when I grab my water bottle, does it fall? That is a rule about the world. We just take it as a fact, right? It's a fact of science, but it's a rule. Why is that rule true? That comes from something bigger than us. And you cannot have that separation in reality, of separation of church from state. But you can have a separation of understanding there are truths and there are moral and religious ideas, and they can be separated, but they cannot be separated entirely because they are essentially two parts of the same world in which you live.
So about the interaction between the religious thought and the political movement, do you see anything positive if we do it the other way around? How do you think when the political movement reforms the political the religious thought? Does it ever happen in history? Or
yeah, actually it happens a lot in history. I think more than we like to admit, certainly more than churches like to admit. One of the largest problems, and I talked about this before with the Catholic Church, and I do not mean this to offend anyone who is Catholic, but it is a fact about the Catholic Church, is the fact that it was a political entity long before it was a religious entity. The Catholic Church was started by the Roman Emperor Constantine, who became a Christian and decided to reform his country into a Christian one. So his political understanding was informed entirely by religion, and his religion was built entirely around his politics, because he was at heart a politician. And so there are many times in which this happens. It certainly happens in the United States, where a lot of people interpret the idea of freedom that comes from God. For instance, in Christianity, there is an understanding that when Jesus died on the cross for people's sins, that he gave them freedom to act, as they would choose to act. The idea here is that because we have freedom, we can do anything. We can do anything, we can be as free, we can do things that are bad, that are societally bad things to do, but it's fine because it's freedom. When in reality, that is a political idea. The idea that you have freedom to do anything is a political idea. The reality in religion is that you have freedom from divine punishment, which is a completely different thing than, is that a good thing to do? No, it's not. No, it's not good to steal your neighbor's bread or food. It's not a good thing, despite the fact that you might not have divine punishment. They're two separate questions there. And certainly political movements change religion, or at least the way people view religion, a lot.
So
yeah, and actually, I had a question for you about that. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So what is one way that you think in Indonesia that you've noticed religion being influenced by the political movements rather than the other way around?
So there has been this movement among the people who sees the religion as something dangerous. Some people that admits themselves to be agnostic, and they I don't know how to say it, but they declare their rights against the religious reference in the public space. So in the public school, there should be no hijab. There should be no praying before starting the class. There's no public appearance of the Bible, of the Ten Commandments, and the religious rituals that we do in public spaces. There has been this movement, but it's not so massively done. But we face it here in Indonesia. So
interesting. Yeah, I think it comes all over the world, and I think that actually, if the listeners, kind of think about it, you'll notice those movements a lot. You'll notice those places where religion and politics really fight each other happening all the time.
Yeah, we got another question here from Miss Selfie Handayani. So far, what is the movement of the World Church in combating the issues of environmental damage?
So that's a good question. I think that it's a little tough to answer from the sense that the World Church is not as coalesced into one body as maybe it should be. So of course, the Christian church is split up into its denominations and groups. But in general, I think that the way that Christian perspective, and I'm assuming she's talking when she says church about the Christian perspective, is that life is inherently precious. This is actually true in other religions as well, but I think it's majority a Christian. It's something that you see in the Christian world a lot. Life is important, and so you try as much as possible to preserve life. When you have environmental issues, you try to preserve life, but at the same time, you have to understand that human life is more important because humans are in the image of God. They are God. They are the only thing able to talk to God. They're the only thing able to understand things in a moral sense. So they have a deeper responsibility than any other life to respect life. So when we deal with, for instance, environmental disasters, the Christian or the church's perspective, as far as I understand it, is to first take care of making sure that the people are made safe and are fed, and then fixing the environment that was destroyed after it. So in general, I think you'll notice that in areas where the church works, humanitarian efforts are much more valued than are strictly environmental ones. Environmental ones are important, but they come second to humanitarian efforts.
So yeah, it's actually an interesting topic to measure the importance of one species over another. And I think there are some people who thought about it in more egalitarian way to contrast whether the human should be put first before the others. And I guess it's going to be an interesting thing to talk in our future sessions. I guess we have seen positive feedbacks from the comment section. Finally, it's the time that set us apart. On behalf of Uplifting Indonesia, we are really grateful to have you here, Jackson Dunn. It's always been a pleasure to talk to you. You cover a huge range of interests, and I believe that our partnership in the future will going to be amazing. So thank you for coming. Do you have any closing remarks?
I just want to say thank you so much to Uplifting Indonesia, and you, of course, for having me on. I think that I guess if I have to leave you with one last word, it's just that when you look at political ideas, or when you look at the church ideas, that you have to first determine what's right and wrong. And I think that if you do that, life will be easier for you, and certainly it will make more sense. And I'm excited to discuss further in the future. So I'm excited that we got to do it, and anytime.
Great, thank you. So once again, on behalf of Uplifting Indonesia, thank you for the presence of our audience. It's either in the Zoom room and the YouTube channel. Please consider to subscribe to help this channel grow, to connect as much as possible the scholars from different parts of the world, to enhance our understanding to our contemporary society. So thank you. We will see you guys in our next session with a more interesting topic. Have a nice day, everyone. Thank you.